Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion starts a series of presentations focused on modern management client apps specifically and how they work in Intune. This session will be an introduction, just a quick look at things to know where we're going and so on. Again, part one, this is the introduction. So here's where we're going, wanting to understand what client apps are, and again, why we care, do a bit of an overview, show how it works, walk you through some things in the console, just showing you the client apps area, talk through some things, look at what's next, and then we'll be done. So in terms of client apps, what are client apps? Well, client apps are what those of us who have come from the traditional desktop deployment type scenarios using tools like Configuration Manager. The client apps section of Intune is the closest equivalent for software distribution in Config Manager. Now, there's things that you can do in client apps that you can't really do in Config Manager, and there's things that you can do in Config Manager that you can't really do in client apps, but that's not all that unexpected, right? And so we'll just talk about what client apps gives for us to be able to do. So again, specifically client apps, managed app deployment for Windows, iOS, Android, all the devices that are supportable in Intune. And each device has its own capabilities and nuances that we will talk about as we go through the series. Multiple app styles is what that was supposed to be. Multiple app styles, so store-based, commercial, custom. We'll see more of that as we go along. All right. So why client apps? Well, again, it's all about application deployment. Enterprises need to be able to deploy apps, to be able to provide a solution that will get software to devices and things that need to be managed, be able to update that software, so on. Client apps is the solution for that. Client apps is also the solution to manage those applications. So when we talk about app management, we talk about two big categories that we'll talk about more in a minute: app protection and then app configuration, right? So just to preview, app protection is really what we describe as MAM, Microsoft Application Management, where you can enforce certain application protections on the app itself versus having to do it at the device level. And then we talk about app configuration, where you might want to help provide some initial configuration so the setup of an app or the use of an app or whatever the case may be is easier. So here's an overview of client apps. I might have missed something in this list, hope not, but certainly what I didn't include in this list are Windows Phone and Windows 8.1. Those are supported, but they're not widely used anymore, so not really including them here. Right? Windows 10, we can handle deploying. Intune handles deploying store apps, deploying Office 365 apps, deploying line of business apps, if you will, web links, and even Win32 apps, as we'll talk about further in the series. iOS, Mac, same kind of thing. The one thing it doesn't have is Win32 apps. And then Android, very, very similar. So each one, again, is different, kind of, right? Concepts are very similar, but there can be some nuances. So how does this thing work? How does client app deployment work in Intune? Well, very simple graphic to try to help explain. So Intune, as we've talked about, is part of Azure. Intune also leverages Azure AD. Now, Azure AD doesn't really matter to the discussion I'm having here. I just have it there because you can't have Intune without Azure AD, right? Well, in Intune, there's also space carved out for storage, right? So you don't really usually even think about it, but it's there in case you need to upload file content and so on. So the way this works is the Intune administrator will go create a client app, upload any required files, and then create a deployment to groups. That information, the files, will be uploaded to Intune storage. All the policy and configurations will happen in Intune and be delivered to the device. And once the device or the user receives the deployment, then the content will be downloaded and the install initiated, right? So pretty easy concept, but just wanted to illustrate. Also, a little nuance about Intune file storage. If you're using a trial subscription of Intune, then your upload capability will be limited to your upload space will be limited to 2 gigabytes. If you're using Intune in a production environment, then the upload space that you can use is really unlimited. So you can put up into Intune storage whatever you need to deploy to your clients. Okay. So now let's just pull in the Intune portal and spend the rest of our time just kind of walking through this. Again, intro session, not going into depth on really anything here. Client apps is what we're talking about though. So let's go into client apps and then we'll just walk through. You'll see that client apps is broken into a few sections: manage, monitor, setup, help, and support. So let's talk through them. So in terms of manage, there are a few things here. Apps, this is the key portion. So if you're going to go create an app, this is where those apps will be ultimately stored. If you click on add, then it will take you through to allow you to select what app type. So for store apps, yeah, we can handle working with the store for any of the supported platforms. You notice Android and Manage Google Play these are both Android. It just depends on what kind of Android device you have. Office 365 for Mac OS and Windows 10, we can handle that. Other web links, built-in apps, line of business apps, Windows apps, right? So it just depends on what you're deploying, what you might want to go configure. Now, that's as far as I'm going to take that, because we'll spend time focused on each type of device and then how you do deployments and so on. App protection policies, we talked about already, but it's interesting. All right, so app protection policies really is this thing called Microsoft Application Management. So let me say it this way. There is the capability to manage an app where the device itself may not be managed at all, right? So you might want to control the uses of data on an app or different structures about the app. And you can do that for apps that are built specifically to allow it. Now, app protection policies, these are supported on iOS and Android only. App protection policies are not needed for Windows. It's a different mechanism for Windows. So for iOS and Android, if you are going to want to deploy app protection policies, then the app itself must be built to accept those protection policies. We call those apps enlightened apps. So think of it as the app at the core with kind of an outer layer of controls that can be brought to bear in order to do different things. Now you see Excel in the list, right? Yes, Excel works. Excel for Android or iOS in this case is what I configured. Let me show you what I mean by app protection policies. So I'll just go look at Excel as an example, and I'll look at the properties. And so I have data protection settings that I can configure, access requirements, conditional launch that I can configure, and so on, right? So here, basically we have data transfer that we can do and configure and different things. I can also go back and define access requirements for an app and so forth. Again, in order to leverage these controls, the app itself has to be built to take advantage of these controls. Right? So anyway, that is a quick look to understand anyway what these app protection policies are. Well, similarly, we have app configuration policies. So this is available for iOS 8 or better. And so what this does is if you have an application you want to deploy to your users or to your devices, but there's some configuration steps that the user using the app might need to take in order to set it up, you can decide to short circuit that and provide configurations for the user so they don't have to worry about doing it themselves, right? So multiple examples of this. Again, the app has to be built for it, but I've got a couple of examples of Outlook, here being configured. So this is where I would go create configurations for Outlook running on a device. So here's a list of my configuration settings. Again, the settings don't really matter. I just show you that you can actually go and configure the settings. And so whenever you pair these app configuration policies with an app that's deployed to the device. So basically you would deploy the app up here, provide the configuration policies here, target so that the device receives both, or the user, sorry, receives both. Then they work in conjunction with when the app's launched. We see the configuration policy and off we go, right? And have that shortcut so the user doesn't have to fill out so much. Along with that, app selective wipe. So this section will work with those apps that we've been talking about. This is supported for all the platforms, and it allows wiping corporate data from devices running a particular managed app. So I can just go create a wipe request, right? And select the user, select the device, however I want to do it, and then go and get that information wiped from the device and so on, right? So again, not going to do it. We'll get into that later, but explaining what it is. iOS app provisioning profiles. So this particular thing is for iOS line of business apps that are built with an included provisioning profile and code with a signed certificate. Really, when you boil this down, what this is a way for administrators to kind of stamp a certificate on top of an app to really effectively ensure file integrity, enforce capabilities, and so on. You can go create a profile if you want to upload your profile file and different things, right? Again, not going to walk through it in detail here, but that's what it is. So that's the manage section. So moving on to monitor. So monitor allows us to go and view app licenses. So as you go and acquire apps from an app store somewhere, there will be licenses that you acquire as a result of doing that acquisition, right? Now, apps may be free, and so those associated licenses may also be free, but you still want to know how many you have. And so this is a nice dashboard to see. Now, again, my lab is my lab. It's not all that exciting, but that's the information that's here. Discovered apps, as we interact with devices, as devices enroll, we will learn what kind of apps are on those devices and be able to display them here, right? So if you want to see, for example, which devices have Adapt Sound, that's easy. Just click on it and we will bring up the list of devices. In my case, my lab, very simple, only one, but that's the kind of interaction that you can do. App install status. So this is allowing you to show kind of a collective app install status across and any failures, device failures, users, whatever the case may be. Platform, again, a dashboard if you want to see how many devices have been targeted by a given app deployment. So I'll just click on Adobe Acrobat here and then see assignments associated and so on, right? Again, my lab, I haven't done a ton of stuff, but all of these sections are applicable. All right. App protection status. So goes hand in hand with the protection stuff that we were talking about, up here. So this is just a nice little dashboard to show the assigned users for different protection profiles and how they've been applied across iOS, Android, and so on. Again, my lab, kind of boring, but it very much shows you what you want to see. Audit logs as well. So this is useful for troubleshooting. This audit logs piece is not a unique piece to client apps. You'll see audit logs throughout different sections of Intune, but again, records activities that generate a change in Intune. So I don't have anything in here, but if there were something that did generate a change in Intune, you would see the detail here might be useful for troubleshooting. So on to setup. So setup, we have iOS VPP tokens. So these are volume purchase program for business tokens. And what these do is they allow you to purchase multiple app licenses for iOS apps, right? If you have them to acquire and be able to deploy to your users. Windows Enterprise Certificate. So this specifically allows specifying a code signing certificate that's going to be used when distributing a line of business app to a managed Windows device. So one of the things that's true about a managed Windows device is in order to install something on it from the store, whatever the case may be, to install on that device, you need that piece of software that you're installing to be recognized and to be validated as okay to install. The way that that's done with store apps and other kinds of apps is through a certificate that's embedded. Well, the line of business apps don't necessarily have certificates, so before you would deploy them, you would want to sign them with a code signing certificate that the device itself would recognize and be able to then take that app deployment without a problem. Similar kind of thing with Windows semantic certs, right? So these are code signing certs that are needed to distribute XAP and WP8.x files and different things. Store for Business. So we'll talk about this in a session. We've talked about the Store for Business integration in Config Manager. You can do the same kind of integration in Intune. And so basically with the Store for Business, all of the apps in Store for Business are apps designed for Windows devices, Windows 10. And so you can integrate with Store for Business and then use Intune to deploy the apps that you care about in Store for Business without a problem at all. Windows sideloading keys. So this is not something we use so much anymore. If you do have Windows 8.1, you will still maybe be using this, but essentially Windows sideloading keys were used back specifically in Windows 8.1, not needed anymore with Windows 10. And specifically, as memory serves, it's been a while, with Windows 8.1 Pro, where you might have a custom app that you wanted to load onto the device, and that process was called sideloading. Right? If you had an app coming from the store, you didn't need to worry about sideloading, but if you specifically had a custom app you were trying to load, you would need a key to enable loading those particular apps. So this is where you would go do that. Again, it's really not something that's used very much anymore, but it's there. So branding and customization allows you to brand and customize your environment to reflect your company. So here, for example, is how you might do that, right? Some options here to give it your own particular look and feel. App categories allows you to categorize apps, so it might make it easier to search for an app that might be of interest. In Company Portal, as an example, you can create your own categories and whatever makes sense to assign your apps, there it is. And then finally, managed Google Play is right here. So in order to deploy content from the store to manage Google devices in some scenarios, you need to be able to have this connection done. So we'll walk through this when we talk about Android, but essentially this is how you go and set that up. And then finally, help and support, right? So this is just an interface to request support for an issue that you might be having. Again, not unique to this particular client apps node. It's ubiquitous across the console, but wanted to show it to you. All right. So again, really quick walkthrough. We'll drill into each of those as we go along. So that wraps us up in terms of that. But there's one more thing I want to show you that we'll get into again as we go through it. But this thing called the Intune Management Extension. Right. Now I show some screenshots of it here. I'm actually going to pull in a real virtual machine that's running the Intune Management Extension so I can show it to you live. So what the Intune Management Extension, also you might hear it referred to sometimes as the sidecar agent, that's what we call it internally, is a piece that gets loaded onto a Windows 10 specifically device to enable certain kinds of deployment scenarios, right? Now, let me also pull this in. So we're talking about client apps, right? Certainly client apps is one place where the Intune Management Extension is used, right? But there's another place too, and that's over here under Device Configuration. We have PowerShell scripts. So this sidecar agent is used for that as well. And effectively, what we talk about a lot whenever you talk to someone about MDM, you hear them say things like, hey, you don't really need a client. MDM is built into the device, and that's true for Windows and Apple and Android. It makes no difference. right? And so those capabilities you can leverage through a management solution like Intune without having to worry about another client. Well, that's absolutely true. That is completely true, right? However, there are certain scenarios that vendors might want to enable that are not yet totally supported by MDM. And certainly third-party MDM providers have done that in some cases. What they've done, is maybe different than what we're doing. It really depends on the needs and what kind of solutions they're trying to provide. But on the Windows side specifically, there are things that business needs in order to be able to deploy effectively on devices. And so we introduced the Intune Management Extension to allow for that. Now, you may or may not have the Intune Management Extension on your device. I'm about to show it to you. Generally, the Intune Management Extension is going to get involved or installed when the device is Azure AD enrolled. That should largely be the case, but if you don't have the Intune Management Extension, just verify what's going on. Again, we'll talk about this later in the session, but in more detail, but just calling it out here, right? So if I go into Services and I look here and roll down to Microsoft, Microsoft Intune Management Extension is right here, right? So this is a service. It gets loaded on the device just automatically. You don't have to do anything to do it. It's running, whatever, so we're good. And so one of the cool things about this, we'll talk about as we go through the different ways to troubleshoot platforms, software distribution or client app deployment to platforms. In the MDM channel itself, there is no logging, right? Well, those of us who are very familiar with Configuration Manager, we love our logs. The nice thing about the Intune Management Extension is that it does have logs to be able to track what's going on. So if you're deploying, and specifically the Management Extension I showed you for PowerShell scripts, but it's also for Win32 type apps and other things, right? So if you're deploying those to a device and you're trying to troubleshoot it, there's a different way to do it with the Intune Management Extension. So just to pop in here real quick again, very quickly, because I'm going to come back to this in a separate session. Come in here under Program Data, and then under Microsoft, we have the Intune Management Extension, and we have logs, and not very many, but we do have a couple, and you can trace through what's specifically going on in these logs, which is very, very nice, right? Now, the actual install of the binaries that support this are installed separately under Intune Management Extension, and you can sift through here and so on, right? But this wanted to show you because it's not immediately evident that we in fact have this, right? So that's really what I wanted to show you there. In terms of troubleshooting tips and tricks, we will work through those. The key thing that I wanted to point out is that we're going to talk through the specifics. You always have help and support that's in the console. You can always open a support incident with CSS. There are, if you want to troubleshoot it yourself, which I would encourage you to, there is the ability to do it. But it's different on each OS, right? One thing that I would say, where possible, this isn't always possible, but where possible, it is maybe beneficial to introduce custom logging, right, for your deployments, so that if the level of logging is not as good as you want from the service itself, or you don't want to dig through the logging or whatever case may be, or there's some specific things you're concerned about in your deployment, you can write your own logs. And again, that can be different based on the way you do it on OSs, but it's certainly possible and something to consider. And then finally, that's really it for what I wanted to show you in this session. But what's next, right? So this is the introduction session. We're going to proceed in this series and really follow through based on OS. We'll do some Windows stuff. We'll do some iOS stuff. We'll do some Android stuff, right? We'll do demonstrations of things that really are outside of the general client app, like the Store for Business. We'll do some discussion around that. So we'll see how far it goes. Right now, I'm kind of anticipating maybe 6 or 7 sessions, but when we get to the end of it, I may have more or less. I don't think less, but more depending on how it goes along. So that said, we will wrap it for this session, and we'll see you for session 2.